Dress the Women, Undress the Men. Dance and Fashion Part 2, Graham to McQueen. Fashion has been inspired by dance's costumes and movement aesthetics, especially ballets, although certainly not limited to it, as we'll see in a few minutes. And dance has looked to fashion for its costumes and notably its bodies. Welcome to part 2 of our Dance and Fashion podcast series. In this chapter, we'll take a look or a listen to tutus through time. As ballet is really beyond a dance form, it is a living artifact woven into history's fabric. Its costumes reflect not only aesthetics, but also politics, class systems, and evolving artistic values. Then we'll land on some of the collaborations between great designers, dancers, and choreographers. From Halston to McQueen, Graham to Guillem, Cunningham to Kawakubo. The first ballet dancers were noblemen from the French courts. That's right, they were all men in the beginning. Their performances influenced heavily by Italian traditions. In the 1500s, Catherine de' Medici of Florence married the future king of France and brought with her to the French courts a taste for the lavish, multidisciplinary court entertainments that she was used to in Italy. These spectacles often included choreographed dances made of intricate walking patterns. The Italians called them balli, while the French termed them ballets. A few generations later, Louis XIV of France, himself a devoted dancer, founded the Paris Opera Ballet. This helped codify ballet terminology and establish the courtly role of the danseur noble, a performer who personified elegance, integrity, and the hierarchical order of the aristocracy. In other words, it was the idealized version of the monarchy itself. Because many of the early performers were actual nobles, their costumes mirrored the fashions of the aristocracy. Men wore the à la romaine or tonnelé, a stiff brocade wired skirt that surprisingly resembles the modern tutu. Italian dancers and choreographers contributed virtuosic feats like high jumps and multiple turns, and France continued to value a more refined elegance. Over time, the two styles coexisted, the noble, restrained style representing monarchy, and a more dynamic pedestrian form that hinted at emerging revolutionary ideals, both societally and technically. Rei Camargo is considered the first revolutionary ballerina, if you will. Born in 1710 in Brussels, Camargo trained in Paris and made her debut with the Paris Opera in 1726. She dazzled audiences with her agility, especially her mastery of traditional male jumping steps, like the entrechat and the cabriole. Camargo's achievements on stage were matched by her off-stage influence. She set trends in hairstyles, danced in 78 ballets and operas, and famously shortened her skirts to calf length for freedom of movement, which was truly shocking for the time. She also removed the heels from her slippers and wore close-fitting drawers, which foreshadowed ballet's tights and, of course, ballet flats. Moving into the Romantic era, which was the early to mid-1800s, the Romantic era of ballet was defined by ethereality, mysticism, and lightness. The movement style had a soft lilt in the back and arms, contrasting with the upright posture of earlier and later periods. Marie Taglioni, born in 1804 in Stockholm, became the icon of this style. Trained primarily by her father, Filippo Taglioni, she made history in the ballet La Sylphide in 1832 at the Paris Opera. This ballet marked a turning point, no pun intended. It was the first full-length ballet performed entirely on point. His performance helped cement point work as the standard in ballet. And her diaphanous costume, a fitted bodice and airy bell-like skirt, became the prototype for the romantic tutu. This light, full skirt has really endured as a staple of classical ballet attire. Fun fact, after one of Taglioni's performances in St. Petersburg, a group of ballet tomaines, which means huge ballet femme, were so obsessed with Taglioni that they allegedly cooked and ate a pair of her point shoes in soup. The Romantic era also gave us the ballet Giselle, another quintessential work still performed today. Together, La Sylphide and Giselle define the Romantic ballet's visual and emotional style. Soft, demure, otherworldly, and we see this expressed in the Romantic tutu, which is what these long, airy bell skirts are still called. And then we have the Classical era, which is the mid to late 1800s. Remember, it's the opposite in music. In music, classical comes first, then romantic. In ballet, it's romantic first and then classical. The Classical era birthed many of the ballets audiences most associate with the art form today. Think Sleeping Beauty, Swan Lake, Nutcracker, La Bayadere, Raymonda, Don Quixote, Paquita, Le Corsaire. These are all ballets from the Classical era. In this time, costuming evolved to support increasing technical demands, and the pancake tutu, flat and stiff and extended from the hips, emerged alongside new levels of virtuosity. Higher extensions, straighter backs necessitated freer legs and less fabric. And this type of tutu is now called the classical tutu. After the classical, we have the neoclassical era, which is the early to mid 20th century. You see, the Russian Revolution and World War I also spurred seismic changes in culture. Many of Imperial Russia's greatest artists became stateless refugees, and the Ballet Russes, a company led by the visionary impresario Sergei Diaghilev, led a radical shift in ballet and the arts. This company was created to show the world the best of Russian art, although they never performed in Russia and many of its artists never went home. In the early 20th century, the Ballet Russes exploded onto the European cultural scene with a force that felt electric. One of its most powerful creative tools was orientalism, the Western fascination with the aesthetics and perceived mystery of Eastern culture. As Edward Said famously explored in his 1978 book Orientalism, and Phil Chan expands on in his book Banishing Orientalism, the Western gaze often framed the East not as a complex, living world of cultures, but as an exotic and fundamentally other place. This framing turns real people and traditions into symbols, fantasies, or backdrops for the ballet. For Diaghilev and his collaborators, Orientalism offered a kind of artistic escape hatch. Through ballets like Scheherazade, Cleopatra, and the Blue God, they transported Parisian audiences into imagined worlds of silk-draped palaces, jeweled opulence, and sensual excess. These productions were deliberate fantasies, artificial, erotic, and spectacular. The sets and costumes, designed by artists like Leon Bakst and Alexander Benoit, drew freely from Persian miniatures, Mughal art, Islamic literature, and North African textiles, remixing them into kaleidoscopic stage worlds. The color palettes were vivid and unexpected. Saffron, turquoise, lapis, and crimson. Fabrics shimmered, turbans coiled high, and the silhouettes were loose and dramatic, unlike anything seen in Western ballet at the time. The influence of the ballet quickly spilled into fashion. Designers like Paul Poiret found direct inspiration in the company's radical style, although he denies it. He introduced harem pants, tunics, and turbans into haute couture, abandoning corsets and traditional tailoring in favor of fluidity and fantasy. Poiret didn't just borrow from the East, he borrowed from Bakst's costume sketches, his collections echoing the same sense of movement, drama, and ornamentation. In this way, the Ballet Russe became a creative engine that fed both the stage and the runway. They helped blur the boundaries between costume and couture. Their influence is still rippling through the decades, touching designers like Yves Saint Laurent, John Galliano, and Jean-Paul Gaultier. At its core, Ballet Russe used Orientalist imagery not just to evoke the exotic, but to rewire the expectations of Western audiences. They introduced a new language of theatrical beauty, one that embraced spectacle and sensuality. As Said argued, Orientalism often tells us more about the West's fantasies than about the East itself. It's also important to note that Ballet Russe's explicit purpose was to share, in quotation marks, true Russian art with the world. But theirs was a kind of fantasy of a more ancient, more pagan Muscovite Russia, which, sharing a continent and trade routes, did also share an aesthetic flavor with other Asian cultures. And the legacy of the Ballet Russe is a paradox, radical and influential, yet from today's point of view, entangled with the politics of exoticism. Diaghilev brought together the who's who of art, dance, and music history, and many of them were complete unknowns before he gave them a chance. In fact, he gave Stravinsky his first big hit, The Commission of the Firebird, and he even introduced George Balanchine, who would go on to found New York City Ballet, and Igor Stravinsky, which completely changed the future of ballet and music history. Balanchine's choreography marked a stark shift in dance's trajectory. Plotless ballets that existed as dance for dance's sake. No longer was ballet only about ornate costuming and complicated plots. No, here we have an emphasis on the music, the body, and most of all, the choreography. Fashion designer Coco Chanel herself was in the audience at the premiere of Stravinsky's Rite of Spring, which was another Diaghilev commission. It premiered in 1913 in Paris, and Chanel became both patron and designer for the Ballet Russe, underwriting many of their seasons. Chanel's signature minimalism echoed the stripped-back style of neoclassical ballet. Another thing to think about is she'd been raised at an orphanage run by French nuns, and many believe that her designs were influenced by the stark asceticism of the convent. And when Diaghilev died in 1929 in Venice, it was Chanel that paid for his funeral. A funny story is that Diaghilev had always been afraid of water. He'd gone to a fortune teller who told him that he would die on the water. So there are a lot of funny stories about the company being on tour and the dancers going a more direct route over water, and Diaghilev would catch up with them sometimes weeks later because he'd gone a circuitous route to avoid the water. And then he died on the water in Venice. And then we have the ballerina as fashion icon. By the 1930s and into the post-war period, the image of the ballerina became increasingly glamorized. Margot Fonteyn is probably the best example. She was really seen as a stand-in for the Queen, for British royalty, and dancers began to double as fashion models. Once again, both embodying a dreamlike ideal, high fashion and ballet mirrored each other. The use of tutus, pointe shoes, and other ballet-specific clothing has inspired fashion designers to create their own interpretations of these elements, giving us a kind of timeless chic in ballet core. But the conversation between dance and fashion is not limited to ballet. After World War I, Europe turned inward, and American artists began defining a unique cultural voice. In dance, this manifested as modern dance, equal parts rejection and reinvention of ballet. And Martha Graham emerged as the most prominent figure. Her style, though different from ballet, was equally structured and expressive. Her movement lived in odd time signatures, in sevens, nines, and 11s, and her choreography centered on emotion and narrative. Costumes were essential to Graham's work, and she partnered with American designer Halston, who created garments that moved with the dancer, and some pieces, once removed, held their shape on stage, becoming characters and props in and of themselves. Halston and Graham's first collaboration was on Lucifer in 1975, created for Rudolf Nureyev and Margot Fonteyn. And Halston followed Graham's famous mantra, dress the women, undress the men. Merce Cunningham, a Graham disciple, opened a completely different chapter. He separated choreography from music, incorporated chance-based rituals, and embraced randomness. His dancers often performed in minimalist unitards, but he later shocked audiences by collaborating with avant-garde fashion designer Rei Kawakubo of Comme des Garçons. She created outlandish, padded costumes inspired by her Lumps and Bumps collection. For Cunningham's scenario, the project was a creative risk for both artists, emphasizing ambiguity and the void. Alexander McQueen, another fashion revolutionary, took the theatricality of ballet even further. In 2009, he designed translucent crinoline kimonos for Enogata, a dance theater work based on the life of an 18th century French cross-dressing spy. Co-created by Sylvie Guillem, Robert Lepage, and Russel Maliphant. The piece was haunted, gender-bending, and brilliant, and McQueen's designs enhanced every layered identity. Thanks for listening. I'm Cynthia Dragoni, The Dance Lens. The Dance Lens is a podcast, a Substack, a YouTube. You can also find us on Instagram and TikTok. It's a place where dance meets the arts, fashion, history, politics, and social evolutions. If you like this and you want more great arts content, make sure you join me on Substack, where we have behind the scenes, great conversations, articles, videos, and more podcasts.